Good afternoon and welcome back. Here we are with a new panel discussion on smart cities for all, eliminating the digital divide through procurement of accessible technologies. The session is moderated by James Thurston, Accessible Digital Transformation Lead North America for Atos. And James will introduce the panelists. James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesca. And thank you all for joining us here for a conversation about something that I know all of our panelists, both here in the room and we have one remote panelist, are very passionate about, and also doing a lot of amazing leadership and work on this issue of inclusive urban environments, inclusive smart cities. And so we want to chat with you a little bit about that today, and we'll be coming at it from the perspective of in large part, one of the initiatives that G3ICT is leading with partners around the world and with cities around the world. And at this point, I should say that Monica Duhem, who runs G3ICT's Global Advisory Center, was meant to be the moderator today, but due to some circumstances was not able to get here from Mexico this week. But do note the name and make sure you reach out to her about some of the great work that you'll be hearing about today. So I'm actually going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Federico, I'm going to go to you last. Just so you know, I'll ask our panelists here in the room to introduce themselves. Hannes, I'll start with you. And I should also note that on the screen there of who the panelists are, we have one additional panelist, Chandra, who will introduce herself and is doing some great work in New Zealand, but we wanted her as part of this conversation as well. So with that, if you could each maybe in a couple minutes let us know your organization, what you're doing, why you care about this issue of inclusive smart cities. Hannes.
Sure. Thank you so much, James. So my name is Hannes Ydin-Agelius, and I'm from the World Blind Union, the global voice of the estimated 253 million persons worldwide who are blind and partially sighted. And since a couple of years back, I've been coordinating our global program on inclusive and accessible urban development, which naturally also captures aspects related to smart cities. Because what we see is that urbanization is rapidly increasing, but that organizational persons with disabilities are not naturally at the table as a key stakeholder in those processes. So we're really trying to address that from the global to the very local level. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know Hannes is also on the advisory committee of the G3ICT Smart Cities for All initiative and is providing great collaboration there. John.
Yeah, my name is John Sullivan. This past year I've been asked to be an advisor with G3ICT, to serve as a fellow. I'm just independent. I'm formerly from the U.S. government, where I led the Section 508 government-wide accessibility program. And what I found in this project we're going to talk about is a real nice transition to take everything we've learned and everything we put together and help share that with these cities that we'll talk about. So it's been exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Chandra?
Kia ora. So hello from me. I'm from New Zealand. I'm actually the country representative for G3ICT in New Zealand. And the inclusive cities and smart cities is a real issue in New Zealand. We're really at the very beginning of our journey. We're actually talking with Monica at the moment. So one of the things that I'd really like to do is just share the journey of where we started, and it's lovely to be invited along. I run a small digital accessibility consultancy in New Zealand, and we have really strong connections with government and with a lot of the disabled persons organisations across the country. So thanks for asking me to be part of this.
Thank you, Chandra. And Federico.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm dialing in from Barcelona. It's currently 10 p.m. My name is Federico Batista Portier. I'm a mulatto man who's speaking here today in Brave. I'm wearing a blue shirt. And I'm known a lot for my smile and my very friendly voice. Anyway, I'm the Accessibility Policy Officer at the United Cities and Local Government, which, to be really quick and concise, it's the largest organization
Great, thank you, Federico. And I think really, Federico, as a testament to your commitment to driving greater inclusivity in cities around the world, and the fact that you're joining us for this conversation at 10:30 at night, we really appreciate you dialing in. So let's maybe start with how for each of you, you're in different organizations, you're approaching these issues of technology deployment, technology procurement in particular, how cities are buying technology, and inclusion in cities from different organizations and perspectives. And I'd love to hear and share with our colleagues here how you see the current state. What does it look like today when we sort of do an assessment of accessibility and inclusion in cities, smart cities today? And I should say, for me, I use a pretty broad definition of smart cities. If a city has a mobile app and a website, and they want to call themselves smart, that's great. But what I want to know is that accessible? Can lots of citizens use that technology that you're buying and deploying? But maybe we'll go in the reverse direction. Chandra, how do things look to you in New Zealand?
So thanks, James. In New Zealand, we're really, as I said, right at the start of the journey. We have a really high uptake of technology and a real use of technology quite widely across a lot of services. The unfortunate thing is that actually digital accessibility and building that into the city's infrastructure has kind of been not adopted quite yet. It's starting to happen. Certainly COVID was an instigator of change and things are starting to move, but at the moment we're very much in our infancy. But I do see, having travelled here to the US, is that what can happen is really quite exciting, and how we can build accessibility into the infrastructure and into the cityscape. I think that's just amazing. And we probably, in New Zealand, adopted technology way faster than a lot of countries, but we just haven't quite got there with regards to accessibility. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate the optimism in looking at this as an opportunity. If cities in New Zealand are leading the way in many ways in adopting technology, deploying technology to support all kinds of city services and programs, wouldn't it be great if we can get them thinking about accessibility and inclusion?
And that's what the goal is, right? Is to encourage them as we are building more and more of that technology to think about the accessibility right from the get-go. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, but we'll get there.
Fantastic. John, from your perspective, how are we doing with cities?
Thanks, James. I've come in, I've worked with 4 of the cities, and each has bits and pieces. They all have the will. They know intellectually they want to do this, they need to do it. What they need is help is how to put it together. How do you get, you've got a built environment today. How do you get from what you have to this smart environment? So you'll see across the different cities, you'll see different pieces. And one example is Kisumu, Kenya had, a definition of an aged person, as one of the starting parts. And they had, they knew there were, they had a thought piece about, well, if we do something like this, who's going to be affected by it? That's really important. Quito, Ecuador had, this organic law on the natural public procurement system, which was a procurement policy. But they had something. And where in Istanbul, they were starting from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they had a law on the disabled, and that was a whole discussion whether or not they should use EN 301-549, but they had that, but they didn't have, and all of them, how centralized or decentralized their IT procurement process is a big factor in how do we go about doing this. So, so what we've been able to do is work with them to, start to frame that policy as a starting point.
So, and maybe just to clarify a bit, the work that you've been doing with G3ICT and with Monica has been with a group of cities across different geographies, and really focused on on helping them to adopt a procurement policy, and we'll get into that in more detail. But you're seeing in the work that you mentioned it, I think the cities Istanbul, Kisumu, Los Angeles, Quito, Sao Paulo, and Valongo. You're seeing some good practices. So you're not starting from scratch necessarily in these cities, but it's maybe an effort of scaling those good practices.
None of them are starting from scratch. They all have different components and different components, yet they need to synthesize them and bring them all together.
Great, and we look forward to hearing more about that. Hannes, I'm going to jump back to Federico, and then we'll come back to you. Federico, from the work that you're doing with the UCLG, and I know you're partnering with a lot of different organizations, including G3ICT, how does it look from, in your driving UCLG's work with cities, the focus on accessibility and inclusion, how does it look from your perspective in the work you're doing when it comes to inclusion in technology and smart cities?
So just to kind of say, we have, accessibility is a broad policy within our organization, but to drive it, we have specific members that have been part of our community of practice on inclusive and accessible cities and territories. So what's interesting there is we have a lot of different contexts. We've got, really high-income countries with high-income local authorities compared to lower-income countries with, local authorities that have really limited budget. And I would say that, just to speak out of what Rajat was mentioning, one of the first things is there's definitely a will there. So, depending on the kind of state that they're in, the will may be one person, or maybe a couple different departments. So the will is there. What we're seeing though is them actually having the technical knowledge and the information to turn that will into action is the missing point, and the data also to drive that. Because at the local level, because budgets are quite low, and also priorities are always in conflict in some ways, probably should work together. The more data, the more concrete evidence, and partnerships that you have will really drive the mayor or governor or elected officials who can really take that decision into actually putting that into action. So the first thing I think is really important about having projects like this one from G3ICT is really training the trainers, because we have to train those leaders in the municipality who are really going to drive that and give them the information and also the solid technical expertise that would allow us to come with a concrete request. So I think cities and local authorities, they're on this kind of journey from going to the theoretical part of being smart and moving to the actual technical part. So there's like a journey that's still at the starting point, but I think much stronger than before, there's actual will, and especially from politicians themselves to show that they're doing something related to the global agenda.
Thank you, Federico. And one of the things that I've really admired in the work that I've observed that you've done in UCLG, including in partnership with some of the panelists here, is really taking it beyond the theoretical with these cities and making it much more tactical and implementable, and would love to hear, we will hear more about that as we get into the conversation, and maybe from you, Federico, too, as we get deeper into the discussion in our other panelists as well. You're doing this work in different geographies around the world, the global north, global south, big cities, small cities. Are there different trends that you see, different strategies that you adopt depending on the different types of cities that you've all been working with? And I'd love to hear more about that. Hannes, before we get into some of that detail, just in general, at a high level, what's the current state? You're working with members around the world of the World Blind Union and with cities. How do you think we're doing?
Well, I like to zoom out a little bit, not only discussing digitalization trends, but what we have seen generally, even before the pandemic, which was truly a stark reminder that the world is not where we're supposed to be in terms of accessibility and the rights of persons with disabilities. We are not where we're hoping to be today. And what we have seen over the course of the last years is, in addition to increased urbanization, I mean, most of us will reside in cities in just a few decades, is also a widening accessibility gap across the digital and also the built environment. And so we are always saying that, we see a crisis on the horizon, but I think the pandemic really evidenced that the crisis is no longer on the horizon, the crisis is here. So we see a global accessibility crisis now, and while we are, as I mentioned, we are becoming urban, already 50% of the population living with disabilities in cities globally face challenges to access services, transportation, and spaces on an equal basis. And if we already have that crisis now, when we are not immediately addressing this across all governments, all sectors, it will not go very well.
So can we be, as you're working with these cities, thinking about being better able to respond to what will very likely be additional crises coming at any point, and I know, Chandra, you have thoughts on that as well, and we'll dig a little bit more into that. Can we be better positioned by being both smarter and more inclusive as cities?
Yeah.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you, Hannes. So I'd like to jump a little bit now into, John, we'll start with you. Some of the work that G3ICT is doing, that you're doing with G3ICT and some of these partners with cities specifically around procurement and what a city buys and how it buys technology that it deploys, both to support all of its services. Increasingly, these cities are using technology for the critical services that cities provide. And if you live in the city, I actually live here in Washington, D.C., and from policing and public safety to transportation to education to courts and justice systems, technology is supporting all of that. Is it inclusive? I think we'll find out. But John, a focus of the work that you're doing with Monica at G3ICT and Smart Cities for All and with these partners is procurement. Can you say a little bit about how you see that link between procurement, that process, those policies, and inclusion in cities?
Yeah, thanks, James. In any organization, the government, city, or otherwise, is there's a portfolio of technology, and it's as organized or unorganized as it may be. And when you come in with this notion of, we really want to be a smart city, and it starts with, what's the customer experience of interacting with the city? What's the user experience look like? And then how on the back end do you make that happen? And there's two dimensions to which you're talking procurement. One is going forward. We want to be this model city, and we want to have these technologies. So we're going to go about and buy, we need to buy new technology services. And how do we make sure through the procurement process that we buy the right, and we don't get into contractual arguments that you didn't specify. You have to ask for what you want, otherwise you may not get it. And so that's the predominant piece here, is you want to make sure that your procurement process is cognizant right from the get-go of what's available, what's the accessibility of the environment in this area, the tools and sets you may have, where's the marketplace, how many are accessible. That's you gotta understand that stuff. You gotta understand the need, who's going to use it, and that's the focus of that area. The other half of that is your existing stock. We've got all this stuff at varying stages of age and accessibility, and what do we do with that? So basically, what do we keep, get rid of, what do we transform into a piece of this new architecture that we're going to have? And that's pretty much the task for all of them, all the ones that we've been working with.
And John, before we go on, Chandra, to you next about this sort of the importance of this link between procurement and inclusion in cities and what they're deploying smart cities. John, do you I'm just curious, bringing the depth of experience you have in procurement and accessibility with the US federal government, do you think cities or the cities you're working with, do they see that link? Or is that something that needs to be between procurement and them being more inclusive? Or is that something that there needs to be some awareness raising on? Maybe John. Just a follow up to you.
Well, I thought you were going to China. Okay. No, in many organizations in these cities, the procurement process is on its own. And, and they have certain conditions and stuff. And, and there's, a goal of the procurement process is to efficiently do the procurement, to buy the right stuff, but get the procurement done. Don't take too long, especially in buying technology. Extended procurement process might, technology may have changed by the time you get there. So their benchmarks are to get the procurement done quickly, get it out the door. And they come along, and then you're saying at the last minute, oh, well, you make sure it's accessible. Well, first of all, they don't know what that means. They don't know how to do it. And they got a list of things that, they may have to consider. And this is another speed bump in the procurement process. So you have to understand the procurement process. But even before that, the accessibility team has to be known to the procurement people. And you have to know what's in the queue to be bought. And if you're blindsided by that, if you don't know what your organization is buying and or building, you're chasing the tail of the dog. You're never going to understand what's really going to go on. And so that's the interrelationship. As the procurement people need to know you're there to help their process do something better for the city in this case, and that you're not working at odds with each other. And sometimes that's a difficult conversation.
And we'll definitely start digging into a lot of that, John, of the mechanics of how you approach a city and work with them to improve how they're deploying accessible technology through procurement and being both inclusive and smart. But before we go into too much more detail, Chandra, I'm curious about New Zealand and how you see this link between procurement and inclusion and accessibility based on your experience, not just with cities even necessarily, but all the organizations that you work with there.
Thanks. I think that one of the things that really needs to be made clear straight off the bat is in New Zealand, we do not currently have any disability legislation. So there is no enforcement about what we do or how we do it. Yes, there is suggestions from the government. There are the standards, there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and so on. But there is no big stick chasing us down to make those procurement decisions inclusively. So what is happening is that there are little pockets of, I suppose, government procurement that do consider accessibility. But to your point, John, often what they're doing is they're just saying to the vendor, it must be accessible. But they don't know what that looks like. They don't know how to check it. They don't know, even if the vendor tells them that it's accessible, they don't know whether or not the vendor is actually telling them the truth or giving them enough information. And what we are seeing, which is, again, sorry, Pollyanna, being very optimistic, in my consultancy, what we're seeing is more and more of the government organisations are actually coming to us and saying, we have just purchased, yes, already the horse is bolted, but we have just purchased a piece of software. We asked for it to be accessible. They told us it was, but we don't think it is. Can you come in, can you do a review, and can you prepare a report so that we can hand that back to the vendor and get them to fix these things? So, I mean, when I'm sort of talking about the purchasing power, we had this discussion before, New Zealand cities are actually quite small, relatively speaking. So most of them don't have massive purchasing power, but it's more at that central government level. So as soon as the central government starts thinking about digital accessibility as a factor in procurement, that's a good thing. But they need to also know what it is, what it looks like, how to test it, how people should be proving it. And I think that opening up of that communication from a purchaser to the vendor and being able to say, hey, we know that you said that this was accessible. It's not. Now you need to fix it, and we ain't paying for it until you do. And I think one of the big things that I've seen in New Zealand is a lot of organisations do not believe that they have the power to go back to the vendor, partly because they're little, they don't necessarily have huge budgets. But as soon as we can give them the tools to ask the right questions, so that they know that they're buying the right thing, but also giving them the power, empowering them to actually go back to vendors. I think that's when we might get that change, but I think the link, coming back to it, the link between inclusion and procurement in New Zealand is still pretty tenuous. I think it's really, really important. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's still afterthoughts. What we want to do is push that left and get them thinking about it earlier, but that's very difficult when there's no big stick telling them that they have to. So there's a whole myriad of factors that are involved there.
So there in New Zealand, and I've talked with you in the past about this, that link, as you said, is tenuous. I think that's a good description, not probably just in that link is tenuous between procurement and inclusion and accessibility in New Zealand cities, but probably other organizations and in other geographies as well. But I like that you mentioned purchasing power, which I think it is even with small cities in smaller countries. I won't say small. There's still considerable purchasing power there. I think here in the U.S., the federal government consumes 25% of all technology purchased. If you add in states and local governments, it's above 40%. That's enormous purchasing power, probably somewhat similar in New Zealand. Federico, if we're thinking about this link between procurement and inclusion, how does UCLG see that? I know you work with cities around the world in all geographies in a whole bunch of different ways. But you are working on this issue, certainly in accessibility, but even in procurement. So I'm curious if maybe UCLG has a particular take on that link between procurement and inclusion.
Yeah, I guess I really wanted to thank my colleagues before saying that with this kind of capacity for local authorities to really understand basically that what they're buying is actually cool. And I think we'll probably do this later, but I think this is a critical point because I think that's kind of what we're seeing for the next step in terms of that. But anyway, that to go a little bit forward. This link between procurement and inclusion for UCLG, I would say it's quite, in a broader sense, it's what actually is being seen at a real level with our members, that there is not a really intrinsic link, that there's not a connection, and that's what is so important and good about this project, and us really taking this project not only from the cities that were part of the pilot, but also putting it in capacity building to see if they really see that there is a link, because there's a lot of disconnect, especially in departments who work on inclusion and accessibility into other departments, and usually inclusion is seen as something kind of nice to talk about, but it still, in some aspects, can remain a little bit top level without a lot of connection to other departments, even though the department working on inclusion or accessibility is usually connected. You would think inclusion would mean that they would work with other departments. There tends to be that side. So you
Thank you so much, Federica. And it does sort of remind you, as you're talking through the different kinds of cities and the different ways of working with different cities and different geographies, that sort of underpinning all of this in the work that you all are doing is the reality that most of humanity lives in an urban environment, lives in a city. And that trend is increasing in some regions incredibly rapidly. And people with disabilities live in urban environments as well. And so these issues of inclusive smart cities, as cities are becoming more digital, become critically important. Hannes, before we start digging into some of the specifics of your work, all of you in cities and what works and what doesn't work, just any sort of high-level thoughts on that link between procurement and inclusion and accessibility in cities. I've always admired the fact that the World Blind Union has you in a team focused on urban environments. It's not your core mission, urban environments, but you've clearly made that decision at the World Blind Union that this is an area that we need to be focused.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think from the perspective of the World Blind Union, I would say that procurement is absolutely key. Because we see so many cities and local governments who adopt or at least make explicit policy statements about disability, inclusion, to a little bit lesser extent, but still accessibility. Also in relation to smart city and deployment of technology, etc. But what we also see is that despite these higher level commitments at the local level, is that then procurement is an absolutely important vehicle to ensure that they actually meet the policy commitments. And I think that is a link which is not always seen, but it's absolutely critical from our perspective. Because a city which will rely on procurement processes, not all cities do procurement processes because contexts are different and procurement processes are looking very different across localities depending on budgets, context, availability of staff resources, etc. But what we see is that there is usually not one size fits all approach, but we still believe that procurement is absolutely key because when we rely so much on deployment of technology and we have explicit commitments to, for example, accessibility of services or service delivery, then if they procure a product or a service or a facility not enabling us to fulfill our commitments, then we will fail in meeting our own commitments and then revert to the same old story with retrofitting or remediation, which will take quite a lot of resources, if it will even happen.
Absolutely. Thank you for that and for the work that you're doing. And maybe this is a good opportunity, and forgive me if you were going to mention this later, but I know you've developed some resources that have procurement as a centerpiece, in a sense, and maybe some of the folks here would like to know.
Sure, absolutely. I was actually going to address that a bit later, but this is much a better opportunity, I would say. No, so a couple of years back, the World Blind Union, together with some of our key partners, developed an organizational accessibility guide called Accessibility Go, a guide to action, which is framed around 7 key commitment areas from the built environment, ICT, communications, inclusive employment, but as you highlighted, James, also procurement. Because many organizations do procurement processes, and there is no blueprint, but we wanted to provide guidance and assessment frame for any type of organization, including local and regional governments, to actually take stock of where they are in terms of how they address accessibility in procurement processes, like among the other 6 commitment areas, to really take stock of where they are and also visualize where they actually want to go. So this is I do recommend checking it out. It's on the World Blind Union website. But I think it nicely relates to the discussion we are having today about what Procure will ultimately influence if we can reach our objectives of greater inclusion of persons with disabilities.
Great, thank you. I'm a big admirer of that resource. I've used it a lot in my work, so I absolutely encourage you all to check out the World Blind Union website. John, so let's start digging into what works, what doesn't work, and the experience that all of you have working with cities on driving greater accessibility and inclusion, working with smart cities, including through procurement. And John, I know the work that you're doing with Monica and the Smart Cities for All and G3 ICT's Global Advisory Center is, and I'll sort of summarize it a bit, but please feel free to expand and correct me. But basically helping these cities that you're working with around the world adopt a policy, a model policy that was created with the G20 Smart City Alliance and other organizations that tells a city how to be better at buying technology that's accessible and inclusive, which is great. But as you're doing that work, and maybe even reference some of the cities you've worked with, when you go into a city, and I'll come to the rest of you on this as well, are there key parts of the city? What are you looking for as connection points in that city to really start driving this work forward of getting them to adopt a policy for better procurement of accessible technology?
Yeah, I'd start with, I think everyone in this room knows, you got to have the right people in the room. You got to have the will, the right people in the room. It's got to have roots into, I talked earlier about some of the, some have existing policies both in this disability rights space, in the procurement space. You got, and national laws. For some, you have to pick what standard. And I know for Quito, it was, that was a question on the table, is which standard, they weren't really held. Istanbul, on the other hand, felt they, because, their commitments as part of the EU, that the EU standard made sense for them. They got to have that. You've got to understand how you're going to mold it. And so what we did with each of the 4 cities that I worked on was just, here's how you put together what your policy needs to be. And it had several typical, things you would expect that it would have to be in a policy, but it had to be grounded. And you can look up the details of all the pieces there. But what was most important is that you have to have kind of cross-referencing of policies. Because you can come up with a great accessibility policy and hide it in the back room and no one knows it exists. So as you go back to your procurement policy, the procurement policy has to have, from that angle over to has to reference back so that you can't go through the procurement process without having the accessibility, the tender research put in place, the evaluation to put into the contract, how is, who's going to do the testing? Is it the customer? Is it the vendor? You it calls down to, if you don't ask for it, you can't be sure you're going to get it, And so you go through that. But then it has to be grounded also into your, people, last session here is all about the user experience and, and your customer experience. And that's driven by a different team of people in the city that want to, improve your citizen services. And so you got to connect to there. A connection back to the legal background. Your legal offices needs to understand what you're doing and how you're offering services. And you get into some of the technical details about legal signatures, et cetera, and what constitutes that. So it's, and that's why a good accessibility program manager can talk in all these different dimensions. And that's really key to, being able to pull it off.
John and Federico, I'll come to you next on this question. But in terms of the people in the cities, the roles, the departments, did you find in the work that G3ICT has been doing with cities around the world, was it easier or harder to pull in any different groups in the city?
Well, I think they had the groundswell of energy in the room just by, who showed up in the meetings. And it was, a wide, they had a lot of people involved in the beginning. And then, as you go further into the process, everyone's busy, but you boil down to who's doing it. And that largely came to, a combination of the procurement people, but led by the IT people. They were the ones really, because I think they understand what's involved in to become a smart city, hear from the others, let's do this in an accessible manner. But again, it's the forefront of, you have to understand the procurement process in your particular organization. How do they work and how do they make their decisions and fit into that?
Great. Thanks. Federico, sort of playing off of that, and you've mentioned already in your remarks a bit about different roles and parts of city organizations, and you know better than most people probably that cities are structured and governed in different ways. There's strong mayor cities, strong city council, city manager approach. In the cities that you've been working with on this issue of inclusion, accessibility, and procurement, are there key parts of the city that you look to first? You try to sort of pull in first that hopefully can evangelize to the rest of the departments that need to be there? Are there departments that are typically harder to engage on the topic?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the lucky thing with the creative practice is that it itself kind of an interesting laboratory because the majority of the people are not really from the same department. They tend to be people who have a connection already with disability in their personal life, either they're a person with disability themselves, or they're taking care of an older relative, or their parents have a young child with a disability. So we have like a very range of things from somebody that's you know, a sub-director of the department to somebody who's a municipal counselor, and then in one case we do have somebody who's a mayor. I would say, ideally, you know, in an ideal world, I would always look for the city council as a key connection to make, because usually in the work that we're doing, city council members have such a faster way to connect with all the different departments, and also the way that they connect with the head, whether it's the governor or the mayor, it goes a lot faster, and that tends to have much more ownership from the city, as opposed to department head, which is still very good, but it can, at the time to really execute a project or something, you will see that there hasn't really been a link, and that can really limit it. But in the reality, the most important thing is really finding those key people. And one thing that we do from UCLG, especially when the department head is able to have that really clear link to the international relations department or city council, what we try to do is provide that capacity as this kind of global way for local regional government that kind of creates a little bit of incentive from the higher up, right? So this kind of community practice has also been a real tool for city officials who are maybe not so linked to the broader agenda to then really take that forward by saying, hey, we're working with this global organization who is also connecting with the UN work and things, and that becomes a bit more attractive as superficial as it is to say, but it's a good way to kind of get more attention on those departments that most of the time are not getting enough, even both at the decision level and the financing level, enough attention. So I would say first, you're looking for that person who's really going to put the work in, that really wants to see that, and luckily, you know, which has been majority of the case with the city that we've been working with, there always tends to be, which of course is representative of disability around the world, somebody who has that connection, and I think that it shouldn't be that way, but that is kind of the driving force right now, and has been a really game changer because you can really see that when you combine efforts with partnership with you know, a leadership role and tools, you can really get people's attention more on the subject. And you know, we were mentioning it earlier, nobody really wants to exclude, but it's just making that a real priority and showing people that this is not just something nice to work on, but it's also very innovative and provides a legacy of your city that cities are wanting to have, right? You want to be that innovative people in the city that when that city official leaves, it's like, wow, this was an amazing government. And that's what we're providing through this work that we're doing. It's a way for cities to tell a story that becomes a legacy of that city. And the more that legacy becomes a part of the city, the stronger that it is to keep going on after the changing government happens.
Fantastic. And thank you, Federico, for focusing a bit on the importance of the City Council, both for their connections to different departments and bringing them in, but ultimately, in many cities, they're going to be providing the funding both to purchase technology and to support implementation of policies and holding the executive branch accountable, and mayors come and go. So if the city council can actually enshrine one of these procurement policies, it would transcend any different administration of a mayor. So thanks for raising that. Chandra and Hannes, before we go on to the next question, either or both of you would like to sort of chime in as you're starting to work with the city. Are there pressure points where you go first, or?
So it's interesting, actually, James. I kind of think if I could flip that on its side, actually, and go, where should these activities actually happen? So they're not happening at all in New Zealand at the moment. But I think of an example about 10 or 11 years ago, Christchurch, my home city, was pretty much decimated by a pretty nasty series of earthquakes. And at that particular point in time, everybody was, really, really trying to figure out how could we rebuild the city in a way that was built for the future. The unfortunate thing is that actually we didn't have anybody who had that voice to stand up and say, hey, listen, can we build in an accessible city? We used accessible city, or the term was used in a much more, hey, we want people to come, not as in we want people to be able to use and interact. And it was a much broader use of the word accessible. I kind of think that at that time, there were so many opportunities for smart technology that could have helped people with disabilities. So imagine a city that's got most of the streets are broken, and to get from point A to point B on any given day will be different than it was the day before, because roadworks are happening and buildings are changing and the sidewalks are broken in various different places. And one of the things that's come out after, sort of in the recent years, is a lovely mapping app that actually helps you find your way from point A to point B. But if we'd thought about that 10 years ago, when this first happened, or implemented some of this really smart technology way back then, we could have made it a whole lot easier now. So you mentioned earlier, John, about the legacy technology, and I think the place that we need to start in New Zealand is now moving forward, not going back, but moving forward. What can we do to build stuff in right now? If we try to go back and fix or remediate or replace, I don't think we've got the finances or the appetite to do that. But if we can try and influence the councillors, the government, central government certainly is currently listening. I don't know if they were the UN, the CRPD review was earlier on this year. New Zealand did not get a very good report card, so they're very receptive at the moment to this sort of thing. So I think it is the people who have the power to change or to make decisions. But I hear you. It's really important that we have advocates from the community who are driving that change, because there's random councillor X is not going to speak up unless somebody is whispering in his ear, or unless that particular councillor has experience in the disability space. But yeah, I think it should have happened right at the beginning, but we'll get there eventually.
I like the focus on, in adversity, there's some opportunity to rebuild better and think about things more smartly. I also really like, and Hannes, I'm going to come to you on this question of who should be engaged, but thank you for raising the disability community in the city. Need to be a part of the conversation about how we use policy, like procurement policy, to advance inclusion in smart cities. But before we go on to the next question, I'll come to you, Hannes, on this one of who do we engage? The next question we'll get to is sort of a lightning round of a couple lessons learned or best practices. You can start thinking about that. But Hannes, anything you want to add to, as you're working with cities around the world through the World Blind Union, are there key parts of the city or of the community that you try to make sure are included and included early?
Yeah, no, I mean, first, just to build on some of the previous points mentioned, I think what we have seen in our work, including together with United Cities and local governments, but also the UN, United Nations Human Citizens Program, is that there is definitely an increased commitment to disability inclusion and accessibility, including from UCLG and the UN Habitat. But many times we have also seen that in the sort of local and regional government space, there is no sort of disagreement about the why aspects, why this is critical, but rather how to do it, right? And I think the work highlighted previously around the model procurement policy and many of the initiatives really led by G3ICT is about the how. And that's also a perspective we take in the World Blind Union, because for us, how, of course, it relates to legal obligations, systems, and practices, but it also relates to engagement aspects, building on to the next question. That for us, we have seen a history where many times the organized constituency of persons with disabilities have not had a seat at the table in relation to urban planning and design and the development and creation of our cities. So that's what we are trying to address, as I highlighted before. And of course, throughout our membership, that's what we hope to see also increase in the future, that the organized constituency of our membership of persons who are blind and partially sighted have an active role to play in urban governance, design processes, consultations, not as a tick-a-box exercise, but actively have an active role as an expert at local level. Imagining that you're sitting in a meeting or throughout the process with your urban planner or city architect at a sort of balanced level where you feel that your concerns, your experience, your expertise are accounted for, and that you also feel that you have something to take away from that process, so it will not be a tick-the-box exercise.
Fantastic. So before we check in and see if there's questions from you in the audience, maybe I could just ask you each quickly, and John, we'll start with you. Just one or two best practices or good practices or lessons learned, things that people who may be thinking about engaging with their city on procurement and inclusion might want to bring to their experience based on what you've done with cities. Any lessons learned or best practices?
I'm going to just go on what we've been discussing about. You've got to have champions, and they got to be internal and external. Again, you need the external to survive. The internals are going to come and go faster than the external will. So you need that push to go through. This is not going to happen overnight, and therefore you've got to have that. And then and internally, usually the process for ensuring a dimension of built-out IT, look at what's going on for security. There's all kinds of security checks and balances, and so if you emulate whatever your organization, your city is used to doing for maintaining security, and just apply accessibility to it, you've got kind of precedent set, and you can follow that.
Fantastic. So champions and leverage your approaches to security and governance systems, do the same thing or similar for accessibility in the city. Fantastic.
Yes.
Chandra.
Okay, I have two things. One is that one of the bonuses that has happened is that as the disability community has started to drive for innovation and smart cities and smart information, one of the things is actually piggybacking off existing technology and creating solutions that work for disabled people, but work for everybody already, if that makes sense. So an example is the Snap, Send, Solve kind of solution for local governments. You see a pothole and you take a photo and then you send it through to the local council and they fix it. Awesome. And this kind of technology exists everywhere. But what we've done is that in New Zealand, they've decided, hey, look, let's use that existing infrastructure and include things like blind people can report where there are obstacles on the footpath, or we can report that there is somebody who's not got the mobility pass in a mobility car park. So it's using that existing infrastructure and just building an additional layer on top. So that's one thing. The other thing is that actually we're just engaging with Monica right now to have a conversation around, hey, how could little old New Zealand actually take all of the tools that have been built over the years and actually implement them in a country, rather than a city, but in a country that doesn't have that legislation to drive it, doesn't necessarily have the visibility that we do elsewhere, and actually currently doesn't have a lot of the infrastructure that I see elsewhere. So yeah, I'm really excited about what we can do. So yeah.
Fantastic. I love the example of leveraging existing smart solutions to put in added features that make the city more inclusive and accessible. Federico, a couple of things, one or two things, lessons learned, best practices that you've pulled together over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I like that also within this project, I think is something we replicate and use, is just having the city really connect what they're doing already from the beginning with local organizations with disabilities. So, we have this in the case of Kisumu and Bologna is also working on this right now. But this came up, during the project. I think it's something that we can do it initially at the beginning of the project, already put it as a prerequisite when it's, because I think it's a great way. And cities are always looking for a way to engage effectively with organizations of persons with disabilities, but they don't know how. So I think putting that into the process is really important. And another thing that I'm really interested to see is kind of this after the adoption phase, and something that's come up a lot for the cities, is basically, not only this policy, what technology is out there that is accessible that we could put into our actual implementation strategy. So I'm really interested to see how we can work together with partners to create some kind of database of solutions. And really interestingly enough, we were in the One Human Rights Reform the last week. We had a representative from SK coming on the panel with us. And it was like a perfect way, because we talked about the learning project, what kind of the main outcomes, what departments work together. And then at the end, SKT, the Universal Design Director, was presenting the solution that they created. And kind of then as a private company based in Korea, having the implementation of where, how the solution would look like in other places. But then it's another Kisumu thing that they would love to kind of see something like this as part of their strategy implementation on the procurement policy. So I think really that solutions database is kind of creating a good connection between that public and private sector would be kind of an excellent way to really grow this project. And I think the more and more that we would work on different cities and other private sector, that solutions database would get bigger and just be a growing resource of accessible technology. And when you have your procurement policy, you're like, hey, okay, what do I need a transportation app, or I need an app for medical services. Let me go to this database and look specifically in the sector I'm looking for this accessible technology, and that would be it.
We've certainly talked a lot about, obviously, engaging organizations of persons with disabilities, but Federico, thanks for bringing up also there's opportunity in engaging the technology sector, the companies that are creating these smart solutions, engaging them as part of this as well. Hannes, just quickly, any best practices or lessons learned from the work that the World Blind Union is doing?
I think there is a lot. Maybe not all good best practices, but of course there is a lot of learnings. I always refrain from talking about what is best, because contexts are always different. So there are good practices, but rarely best. But it could be best for that specific city, of course. I think, and we have already touched upon this previously, I think one key learnings we see as a bottleneck hindering full implementation of accessibility across the built and digital environment in a local context is the lack of interagency coordination. That sometimes disability or accessibility is seen very, very narrowly, very siloed. What we have seen is that, as I was talking about before, that maybe we know the why but not the how. What we also see is that many times they say, yes, we are very committed to accessibility, etc., but then they only talk about ramps. And we all know, and I think that's something which has come up a lot during the conference for the last few days, is that accessibility is so much more. It's very comprehensive, it requires a holistic approach. So we have seen that together with the fact that in our experiences from being engaged at the global and regional level around sustainable urbanization, is that when accessibility is is mentioned and discussed, it many times, we many times realize that what is actually meant is availability or affordability, but not accessibility. So that's what we have also seen. But moving forward, we believe that the best practice, or the good practice, I would say the best practice, actually there is one best practice, it's engagement. And it is when the local and regional government, together with industry, academia, and the organized constituency of persons with disabilities, are actually working together to find the best solutions for that situation, for that context, which is truly responding to the rights, needs, and requirements of the constituency actually living there.
Fantastic. So that's fantastic. I like ending this session on that idea of breaking down silos and engaging to scale up progress through these procurement policies with cities, smart cities. With that, we're out of time. I would encourage you all, though, to talk to some of these panelists. They're doing fantastic work around the world with cities, and also reach out to Monica Duhem at G3ICT, who's leading their work with inclusive smart cities around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, and the panelists. Great panel. I would like to invite you to remain in the ballroom for the keynote address with Peter Korn, Director of Accessibility at Amazon Devices and Services. We'll just take a few minutes break to allow other participants to come back from their own sessions, but we'll start at 5:30 here back in the ballroom. Thank you.